We're joined today by Rosie Bullard from James Hambro Partners. Thankfully, Rosie's a regular contributor to our interviews. Hello, Rosie.
Hello, Rory. Very good to be asked back again. Thank you.
And thank you very much for coming. So this is the second of our interviews in this topic. Today, we're very much going to talk about inheritance and how that affects properties. For example, the main residence properties, buy-to-lets, holiday properties, and how a family might start uh, putting that in place for the younger generations to come. So, Rosie, with the current legislations that have been changing on a very regular basis, as we all know at the moment, what is the situation with well, let's start with the residential properties for the for inheritance factors.
So, from an inheritance perspective, there are certain reliefs which allow you to pass your family home onto the next generation. There are stipulations around that in terms of value, for example. But we find a lot of people nowadays not only own their own property, but they might also have a holiday home, perhaps some buy-to-lets. And so, thinking about how they can pass those assets down to the next generation has very much come to the forefront of people's minds, particularly with muted changes to inheritance tax legislation in the UK.
Because there's been such a change to the actual pensions, like SIPs, for example, people are now starting to focus on the inheritance within inside the property as well, because that still has some inheritance benefits, doesn't it? So, what would you do with, for example, we use myself as an example. I have two children. We have buy-to-lets in London, and we do have a holiday home. How, at my age now, I'm 54 years old. What would be, without obviously giving advice here, what would be a good idea for me to start considering with my buy-to-lets, for example?
Inheritance and gifting assets to the next generation is so personal. Everyone has different family dynamics, everyone has different children, and indeed within one family, one child could be very different to another. So whilst it's really important to start to think about how can you pass wealth to the next generation effectively, you shouldn't let tax be the main driver of your decisions. For example, a lot of people think about the fact that they have a lovely holiday home. A lovely holiday home in the lakes, in Cornwall. It might have been in the family for a long time. And as individuals get later on in life, they think, well, I'd really like to keep this in the family. I want to pass it down to the next generation. So we need to think about the tax implications of that. What impact does that have from an inheritance tax perspective? When do I start that 7-year clock? What impact does it have from a capital gains tax perspective? Am I triggering a disposal? How am I going to pay for that tax exposure in an asset that's not liquid? I can't sell a proportion of a portfolio. I can't sell a proportion of the property, unlike you could do with a portfolio. Then there's a thought about, well, who am I going to pass it down to? Am I going to pass it down to the eldest? Am I going to pass it down to the youngest? Am I going to pass it down to my children in equal shares? That might work for their generation, but what about when it comes to the generation below them? There are considerations in terms of the costs associated with running that family property. Who's going to pay for that? Are you going to expose your children to double council tax because it becomes their second property? Who's going to pay for the maintenance? If your children aren't in a position where they're financially secure, do you end up making additional gifts in order to keep the maintenance of that property? So there are just so many things that you need to think about outside just the tax element.
So, basically, the message behind that there is that there's a lot of planning that goes into this that needs consideration, but also the planning along the lines of if it is like for a holiday home, for example, if it is in another country, there's different tax laws to those countries, there's different will laws to those countries that need to be researched and looked into properly.
Wills are really a really important consideration, particularly if you have properties in other jurisdictions. In most European countries, it's governed by very different laws, civil law versus common law that we have here. So it's important you have made a plan with those properties, particularly if you do want to keep them in the family and pass them on to the next generation.
That's a very important part. The planning is key to getting this right, obviously. Now, with regards to, say, buy-to-lets in the UK, I mean, there's been quite a few different legislation changes over the last, I'm going to say, 7 years, with the double taxation coming, or the double taxation, I call it, as in you can't have mortgage relief against income on the properties. Therefore, that pushes you up to a higher tax bracket, which is a big consideration for a client as to whether it's an ongoing concern. So, are there any fixes for this? Are there any suggestions of what a family could do to make this a wee bit more efficient?
Mm. Well, as we talked about in our last discussion, the environment for being a property owner, buy-to-lets included, has changed materially in terms of the tax implications of that. Now, within the family, you can certainly plan in terms of who owns those buy-to-lets in this particular case, and therefore who receives the income. And it might be that you put a property into a lower income earner within the family. The big challenge, though, of course, is that if the original owner of those properties needs that rental income, where are they going to get their income from if they've gifted assets? Or if there's debt against the properties, can another member of the family afford to service a mortgage? Will they even be granted a mortgage? So it's not as straightforward as just passing assets between family members.
So the other option is obviously to set up a family property company where you can put the properties into, but that also has tax implications such as stamp duty of putting the properties across into the company. However, I mean, the one thing that is sort of underpins all this, which is always the question, which is very much what's on my mind at the moment, is is there a benefit to selling the properties down and putting the capital gains into a portfolio? I mean, that's certainly where my mind is heading at the moment, because for my personal view, it's a lot easier because the wealth manager then runs the portfolio. I don't have to do all the boiler fixing and whatnot. And it also doesn't push me into a higher rate tax bracket because my investment's then in my SIP or in my ISAs, and therefore it's tax efficient. Um, but that, as again, that all comes into the planning side, which is the financial planning side of a wealth management relationship, which is what we all come to you guys for.
Indeed. And picking up on your earlier point about structuring for a family, there are tax implications of doing so. There are costs associated with doing so, administrative costs, reporting costs if you put properties into a trust, into a family investment company, cost to set up, ongoing costs as well. So you need to consider that in terms of your after tax and after cost return. As we talked about in our last discussion, it's not as simple as simply owning an asset and just paying an ongoing management fee. There's a lot more to think about in terms of the costs of upkeep of a property, upkeep of structures. The cost is certainly an important consideration. On your point then of saying, well, maybe I should just sell the properties and have an investment portfolio. Firstly, you've got to take a view on what you think will make the most attractive after tax, after cost return. But the nice thing about doing that is, particularly for a family, if you want to pass down assets to, say, 2 children, by giving them each their own individual assets, splitting the proceeds of a property in half, they have the freedom to decide what risk they want to take, what investment strategy they want to have. Do they want to have parameters around their portfolio, ethical considerations, for example, and they can be as individuals with their own investments and have the freedom and flexibility to influence what their portfolio manager is doing for them. Unlike with a property, if you own that property with your sibling, you've got to make joint decisions. You can't just cut it in half.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's historically, it's always been quite to have both an investment portfolio and the properties, because it hedges your investment bets, doesn't it? However, with such a change in the landscape, landlords such as myself are reconsidering what to do, and time will tell whether all these changes actually make such a meaningful impact on the on having a property portfolio. But at the moment, I'm very much doing the analysis to see which way is right for me, which I'm sure everyone else is. So the key point is here that it takes an awful lot of planning to make sure you're doing the right thing, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Lots of financial planning, cash flow modelling, tax strategies, and then importantly, what are you going to do with that money in terms of from an investment perspective? How are you going to structure your investments, be it property, equities, bonds, cash strategy, etc., in order to meet what you need and indeed the family long term?
Which is an interesting and exciting thing to do. So it's not all doom and gloom. the future is I think the future is quite bright at the moment, especially with the current state of the markets. I think the next couple of years is going to be very exciting for us. So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, indeed.
Rosie, as always, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Very good. Thanks, Rory.
Cheers. Take care.